Talking about back pain today. It's going to be a big one. I know many of you struggle with back pain. It's a bad thing to have to deal with in the golf swing. We're going to get rid of it today.
Distance 186 yards.
So I'm going to take this in a few different segments. So the first part is going to be setup issues that cause back pain. Believe it or not, a lot of back pain is caused from two common setup issues that we're going to address today. And then we're going to do some backswing discussion on what typical faults and mistakes that we make that lead to back pain. And then, of course, the big one at the end is going to be the downswing stuff. That's where the majority of injuries happen. So we're going to talk about some prevention stuff and understanding how to get your back to work the way it was designed to keep you from being in pain. Because as we just saw in these questions, a lot of us out there have a lot of back pain. In fact, back pain is one of the issues that I struggle with that encouraged me to really take this deep dive into developing rotary swing the way that I did, because I was hurt every single time I played golf. I didn't realize it until I finally started taking a break. Like, man, I feel good if I don't play golf. That's not a good sign. If I take a few days off, I feel great. And then after a round of golf, I feel terrible. I'm tired. I'm fatigued. Shouldn't be tired after a round of golf. It's not that physically demanding. So when I started understanding what was causing my back pain and using our medical panel to help us understand from a biomechanical perspective and anatomical perspective what issues we could address in the swing, that's when rotary swing really started taking shape, as really being a way to swing the club that is spine safe. That is huge to me, and I know it's obviously huge to so many of you out there. So first things first, I'm going to talk about setup stuff. I'm going to open up to some questions, and we'll do the backswing stuff, open up to a few more questions, and then downswing, and we'll open to a few more questions. So setup, the number one thing that we see in setup is a little bit of lordosis, a little bit of extra curvature in your lower back. And this happens for a lot of reasons. One is we sit all day, we kind of tend to let our bellies pooch out a little bit. And so that's all great for yoga breathing, but in golf, we need to keep our abs in. You need to imagine that you're pulling your belly button in towards your spine. Now, not so much that it's tight. You don't want your abs to be tight. You don't want anything to be tight, per se, in the swing. But they need to be supportive, because that's really a primary role of your abdominal muscles, is to hold your guts in. Just as silly as it sounds, but it's true. And as that's happening, that's providing support for your lumbar. So for those of you that have a lot of lower back pain, the first thing that you want to do is check setup. If you're set up and you can see kind of this extra curvature in my low back here versus my spine being in neutral, and the simple way to check that is to grab a club, put it against your head, hold it against your middle of your back, and down here around your belt, and hinge forward to get in your setup. Now your lower back, you should have a little gap here. I can stick my hand in between it. It's just really sitting against my belt. There is curvature in your spine that we want to maintain. Then it sits up here high in my thoracic and then my head. This is the safest place for you to put your spine in as you hinge forward. But the tendency is a couple things. One, we just kind of get lazy and we let our back kind of sag. And instantly I feel discomfort here. So make sure if you're doing that, make sure you're standing up and doing this along with me so you can feel this, so that you recognize when you start to have issues. So set up and just kind of let your belt line tilt forward like you're sticking your rear out and letting your back curve. And you should notice pain right away, especially as soon as you start to move, you'll start to feel some bunching there. So first things first, just make sure your back is nice and neutral. You can hold that club against your back like I just demonstrated. Hinge forward from your hip socket. Don't round your lower back. That's another common issue that doesn't necessarily lead to back pain as much as the first, by rounding your lower back, but this leads to a lack of mobility, which then leads to compensations in your swing, which then leads to back pain. So that's the second thing. You can have too much curvature in your spine this way, and you can also bend. A lot of golf instructors used to use the term bend from your waist. And what they were doing is actually telling you to curve your lower back, which again, now as soon as you do this, and if you're standing up with me, put your arms across your chest and try to rotate back and forth, you lose a lot of mobility. So curvature in your spine, we want to maintain the natural curvature in our spine, making sure that It's nice and neutral, and as we hinge forward, we maintain that. Don't let your belly stick out. If you need to feel like you're pulling your belly button in, because gravity is trying to pull your intestines and everything else forward. So those are the two most common setup mistakes. I want to talk about one more that I just did this week, talking about Tiger's back issues and talking about setting up on the left side. This has become a pretty popular thing for a lot of golf instruction out there. And so as you're setting up on the left side, you begin to turn. If you don't allow your hips to turn a lot, if you're hanging on that left side, you start running into the same stuff I showed you with Tiger, that you're pivoting from your sacrum. And so now it's really difficult. You got to be really flexible, but also you're just putting a lot of torque on your spine. So make sure as you set up, when you're set up with any club in the bag, be roughly 50-50. And then as you go back, allow your weight to shift to the right. This is critical because now you're moving your balancing joint to your hip socket. And you can turn on your right hip socket all day and keep your spine completely out of the mix in terms of putting stress on it, versus if you're hanging here and trying to turn like this, it's uncomfortable just doing it slow motion. So those are the three most common setup issues that we see. The first two are more from down the line, and the last one is when you're looking from face on. Make sure you have axis tilt, and then as you go back, you let your weight shift into the right. Let me open up to a few questions here. Any questions on those setup issues? Ralph, I have L3, L4, L4, L5 fuse, most likely have sacrum fuse. Am I done playing golf? No, not necessarily at all. So for those of you who already have back issues out there, now, first of all, I'm not a doctor, obviously. So consult with your surgeon, talk to them first, physical therapist, any other things other than your golf instructor for advice on your spine. I'm here to help you move your body in a way that's safe for the golf swing, but certainly you've got to consult with a medical professional on this stuff. But if you're fused in the lower part of your spine, it doesn't mean your life is over. You can't play golf anymore. It doesn't mean that at all. What it means is that you need to be extra careful to do things to make sure that your spine stays in neutral throughout the swing so that you're not putting extra load on your lumbar. When you're bent over in a way that's putting stress on that, and then you're not allowing your weight to shift to the right, you're putting a tremendous amount of stress on your lumbar area. So it's really important that you keep your spine in neutral, which shouldn't be too terribly difficult because half of them are going to be fused already. So I'm just like, for me, I'm fused at 1, 2, and 3. I don't have any choice what position they're in. So your spine, your lumbar is probably going to be where it's going to be. It's already fused there. But then as you go back, it's really important to let your weight shift so that you're balancing and shifting more on this right hip socket than staying fixed, or worse, hanging on the left side and trying to turn. So any other questions on the setup stuff? These are really simple things to get right, but you really want to stand up and feel them doing them wrong. Let your belly bulge out and then pull your belly button in. And this is oftentimes one of the quickest fixes for back pain in the swing. Alan, good question. Does axis tilt affect back pain one way or another? It can, for sure. So just like when we were looking at from down the line and I was hinging forward this way, trying to keep my spine in neutral, the same is true when viewed from face on. So you've seen me do my little axis tilt drill where I hold a club against my sternum and my belt buckle and then slide my hips to the left till the club hits me in the knee. That's the proper amount of tilt. What a lot of golfers do instead of doing this is they do this. That's not axis tilt, that's spine bend, that's side bend. And so right away, now I'm taking my spine out of neutral from this direction. So it's important that you let your hips slide, and notice that my spine, represented by the club shaft, is still roughly 90 degrees to my pelvis. That's what I'm trying to maintain it in neutral in. My pelvis has to tilt and the belt line is going to drop slightly. But the big thing is that my spine from face on is still staying in neutral. So that's the goal when you're getting set up face on and down the line, is to keep your spine more or less in neutral as best we can. If you start adding side bend, then absolutely it's an incorrect way to get axis tilt, and you will experience some low back pain there, or can. How flared out can your right foot be for mobility? Robert, good question. So no, and it does actually impact what you may experience and feel in your back. I always tell people that you can flare your foot out however much you need to achieve the goal, the positions that we're looking for. So in the downswing, obviously we know that we need to get our hips roughly 90 degrees to the target. So if you can't have your foot square, it feels very strenuous in order to get there, then you flare your foot out until it's comfortable to be in this position. The same is true in the backswing. Whatever we need to do to get a 90-degree shoulder turn, for you that might be 30 degrees of hip rotation, for somebody else it might be 50 degrees of hip rotation. Whatever it's going to take to get that full turn and not feel a tremendous amount of strain and load on that right hip is what you need to do to flare out your foot. So if you can get a full shoulder turn with having your foot square without having to have your hips over rotated, then that's the amount of foot flare that you need. Any other questions on setup? All right. Simple enough. All right, backswing stuff. So now we're going to start moving. And this is where stuff starts really going off the tracks really quickly, is when we actually start moving our body rather than just sitting there statically. And it's really easy to start making really simple mistakes very quickly that lead to a multitude of back issues. So the first one, again, I want to go back to that video I just did on Tiger just because it demonstrates perfectly how subtle the differences are between having a back that's going to feel really good after a round of golf and a back that can be in a lot of pain after a round of golf. And that is weight transfer. Every hitting and throwing sport in the world involves weight transfer. You're never going to see a pitcher wind up like this. He's going to load to the right, step, transfer, turn, so on and so forth. Hitting and throwing sports involve weight transfer. It's critical for momentum, for power, for sequencing, etc. So by Tiger hanging a little bit more on this left side as he was taught, now again your pivot point becomes more or less your sacrum, your pelvis, instead of the hip socket, which is designed to do this. So it's really, really important and really simple to make sure that as you go back, let your weight go to the right. You should almost be able to comfortably lift your left foot up. It's not 100% on the right side, but you shouldn't feel like, oh gosh, in order to be able to lift my left foot up, I've got to make a big body movement in order to get this thing up. As you go to the top, you should feel, maybe transfer 20, 25% more weight, and you can pick it up very quickly and easily. That is a simple check to ensure that you're pivoting on your right hip socket, which is safe and easy to do, versus just staying centered. So many golfers fear the term sway so bad. What's funny is over the last 20 years of teaching, I've seen swaying become kind of like the ugly redheaded stepchild of the golf swing. No matter what we got to do, we got to get rid of your sway. And here's what's ironic about it. There's been such a pervasive change in the message that comes out for the bulk of golf instructors that I hardly ever see anybody sway anymore. In fact, it's probably been 5 or 10 years since that's been a really common problem that we've seen in our in-person lessons. That doesn't mean that people don't sway still. Of course they do. But it's not like it used to be where everybody was convinced that they had this huge head movement and they had to fix it. In fact, what I see more often than not is the opposite, is that people tend to stay too centered and don't allow themselves to move at all. Obviously, I don't want your head moving way off the ball. We allow a little bit of head movement, inch and a half max is really pushing it. Any more than that, then you're starting to add too many variables to the swing. But if you can shift your weight onto the right hip socket without your sway, without a head movement happening, and without a hip sway, this would be a hip sway as your hips are sliding this way and then sliding this way. In the swing, when we're pivoting on the hip socket, that right hip should look like it stays exactly where it started the entire time. But in order for that to happen, I have to shift weight laterally. If I don't and I just turn, this is what's going to happen. Now I'm pivoting around this base of my spine, and you'll see that my hips have to move away from that line. If I was to stay against this right hip line, I have to shift laterally while I'm turning, and that creates the illusion that my hip never moved at all, when in fact it's actually moving diagonally back this way while I'm turning. So it's really important to get this right, because you should feel, if you're doing this right now with me while standing up, that you can stand on your right side very lightly and pivot back and forth and feel no strain on your back at all. If you have a tendency to let your hips actually slide while you're doing this, this is a hip sway, and then you're turning this way, well, now we're running into big problems, because now we're putting our spine not only in a rotated position, twisted position, but a side bend as well. And that's the quickest way to get a bulging disc. So you want to keep that in neutral, maintain your axis tilt. We're in a healthy spine position. A lot of times people start getting into this tilted position where we have side bend and twisting when they start lifting the club with their arms. This is a really common fault, to start going like this. So from down the line, we see this quite a bit. People trying to stay centered and they lift their arms straight up in the air, and that causes you to tilt as a result. Again, the core movements are nothing more than a little bit of hip shift to the right and pulling that right shoulder behind my head, and the whole backswing is pretty much done. I've kept my spine in neutral, I've shifted my weight and made this really, really simple. So backswing stuff, the easiest way to fix it is just to do the simple little things right. A little bit of weight transfer to the right, pushing pressure on that right side, pulling the right shoulder behind your head, and all your back pain issues will then have to be a result of something you did with your arms. But if you get your body to move correctly and be in control during the backswing, then the arms don't have a chance to take over. So backswing stuff should be really, really simple. It's usually revolving around not transferring your weight correctly, either letting your hips slide or sway to the right, or not letting your weight shift at all, and that's causing your body to rotate around the base of your spine. All right, so let's dive into the downswing stuff, because this is where the vast majority of your injuries are going to happen, and why probably most of you tuned in today. In order to fix this stuff, this is really the critical thing that we've got to do. The thing I want you to practice today, so if you have a club, I want you to get up and do this with me, is that we're going to learn to be in a fixed impact position and then release the club. Now, most golfers don't ever quite get the release just right for one of two reasons. One, either their arms are doing too much in the swing and the body is just kind of responding to what the lower body is doing, or the lower body just doesn't get out of the way in time. And what I mean by that is a lot of times golfers get into impact and their hips are still turning, their shoulders may be turning, and everything is causing the club to work to the left. So this is a really common follow-through position or release position that is taught these days, is the handle is working to the left. Now, as I'm doing this, I want you to do this with me while you're watching and following along. So take the club, get down into the delivery position, where your club shaft's about parallel to the ground, hands are about in front of the thigh. And now I want you just to turn your whole body and hold the club face in that same position. And I want you to see what you feel in your back as you do this to move the club to parallel to the ground on the other side. So do this a few times, then if you feel something, put it in the chat board. So I wanted to discuss this with you. So club's parallel to the ground roughly, and now just turn and move the handle to the left, like you see so much golf instruction out there today, to where the club face is actually more or less matching my spine angle. This is so common, but you should start to notice if you're doing this, that you feel a lot of load in your lumbar area. That's where you're almost trying to twist from to get that extra rotation to hold the release of the club off. If you release the club properly, you won't feel any strain in your back. Lower left back pain, definite strain in lower back, exactly. So this stuff, man, this is one of those things I just wish people would stop teaching. It just shocks me. And I understand the reasoning behind it. The reason where this came out was to keep the club face constant through the hitting area, so it's not slamming shut or staying open, because so many golfers try to save the shot with their hands. We obviously don't want you to do that. Nobody can time that consistently. So they said, hey, well, let's just take the face rotation completely out of the swing and make it move at the back. And then, gosh, as you guys feel for yourselves, you instantly start feeling back pain. Now, you're doing this slow motion, and you're only doing it a couple of times. Imagine doing this thousands of times or tens of thousands of times over and over and over again at speed, while hitting the ball, while hitting the ground, taking divots. All of that's putting a tremendous amount of load on your lumbar at a point where you're extremely vulnerable. Your pelvis is not in a stable position. Your spine's no longer in neutral, and it's not designed to bear a bunch of load in this position. This is how you get bulging discs. The worst thing you can do for your spine is to be in a rotated or twist your spine and add side bend to that. So that would look like rotation and now side bend. And if you can feel this again for yourself, you can do rotation, side bend. This way, either way, you're going to start to feel all of that strain in your back. So what I want you to practice today is we're going to do this together. I want you to drill getting into an impact position. So what I mean by that, I want you to get your hips open by straightening this left leg. From base on, make sure it's in neutral. Just drop a club down from your first belt loop, give or take a little bit. And that should go straight up and down. Right foot's on the ground, rolled in. You're hinged forward, so your spine has axis tilt, but very little rotation and side bend in it, as little as humanly possible. And I'm going to show you in a moment with my swing when I step through it frame by frame in just a moment what we're talking about here. So I'm going to get into this impact position.